This equation has four factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero, and that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra, but let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. But there we see an increase of about 1.3. The second factor is the services we use. This encompasses everything: the food we eat, clothing, TV, heating. These are very good things. Getting rid of poverty means providing these services to almost everyone on the planet. And it's a great thing for this number to go up. In the rich world, perhaps the top 1 billion, we probably could cut back and use less. But every year, this number on average is going to go up. So this is a wish. It's a very concrete wish that we invent this technology. If you gave me only one wish for the next 50 years, I can pick who's president, I can pick a vaccine, which is something I love, or I could pick that this thing that's half the cost with no CO2 gets invented. This is the wish I would pick. This is the one with the greatest impact. If we don't get this wish, the division between the people who think short-term and long-term will be terrible, between the US and China, between poor countries and rich, and most of all, the lives of those 2 billion will be far worse.
One of the world's richest men gave away $1 billion today to save children in the developing world from death by diarrhea or pneumonia, with vaccines we take for granted. What's not to admire? Yet decades of aid money from Western governments have now gone to poor countries. Indeed, today, David Cameron promised another £800 million, and the poor and the sick are still with us. Can philanthropy really change the world? Bill Gates is here, as is the boss of GlaxoSmithKline, one of the world's wealthiest drug companies, along with the man who was health minister to one of the world's poorest countries, Rwanda. In the next half hour, they'll face some of their critics. After that, I'm going to talk to the International Development Secretary, Andrew Mitchell, who's spending £8 billion a year of our taxes in aid for the developing world. The setting was a hotel in the square mile of the City of London. In the 4 hours in which some of the richest people in the world and some of the most powerful governments talked, 700 children are estimated to have died of diarrhea and pneumonia. The conference of the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization aims to put an end to that by combining the efforts of philanthropists and governments and drug companies. But what happens when the giving of the private sector begins to dwarf some of the contributions of the state? And how can we hold such people to account for mistakes they might make along the way? Here's Paul Mason.
He made megabucks by monopolizing an entire industry. He drove competitors to the wall, crushed dissent, and then, in one grand gesture, gave it all away. Yes, that was Andrew Carnegie. The modern grandee of philanthropic capitalism is Bill Gates.
Along the way,
today, the former Microsoft mogul was feted as world leaders queued up to give money to his favourite cause, Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. Britain gave $1.3 billion. Bill Gates himself pledged $1 billion on top of the $1.2 billion he's already given to the project.
I like to think of it in terms of equity, that this is the first time that we can say that poor children will not be refused the vaccines that the children in the rich countries get because there's not enough money.
Since the launch of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 1994, Gates has given away $24 billion, more than half of it on global health projects. Last year, he linked up with veteran investor Warren Buffett, who's already pledged to give away 99% of his $62 billion, to launch a spate of giving pledges by the American rich. Gates famously brings business discipline to the projects he chooses to help, demanding clear accountability from governments and imposing strict performance targets on aid agencies. But he has his critics.
Well, if we rely on philanthropists for this charity and this type of aid, what you lose is any type of democratic accountability. So the people in developing countries who are on the receiving end of this aid, they have no structures through which they can challenge whether it's going to the right thing or not.
In 2007, Gates' spending on health was bigger than the annual budget of the World Health Organization. In fact, the foundation is now recognised as one of 8 big agencies which informally determine global health policy, a status which, said a study in The Lancet, confers power and influence on a selected number of organisations and establishes leverage over the voice of civil society. Gates' detractors say by focusing on top-down technical solutions to specific diseases, you may inhibit the development of longer-term sustainable healthcare systems in third-world countries. As for accountability, well, the sheer dependence of charities, universities, research institutions on foundation money mean it's a lot easier to find critics in the world of computing than it is in development.
Well, they are accountable. I mean, there's nowhere to hide in the world. The media, all of you guys, keep us all under the spotlight. And in a way, Bill Gates is probably more under the spotlight than other people. I mean, and also, there's other ways of holding him to account. And we had a mass phone call with the British public the other day, and people could ring in and listen and send questions that he had to answer. And if they want to, they can put him under the spotlight. But I think most people believe that Bill Gates has made a massive difference.
What Bill Gates has done is to seed the market for a new kind of philanthropy. Over the next 20 years, governments will take over the vaccination project and their upfront cash will leverage in much more bang for bucks. At the same time, governments too have adopted the Gates approach, the private sector as the channel for philanthropic funds, the global agencies not currently flavour of the month.
The UK government has cut its funding to the International Labour Organization. It's cut its funding to the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which is trying to build up developing countries' industrial strength. It's cut its funding to grassroots groups in developing countries and indeed in Britain who are trying to build these campaigns against tax dodging, against injustice in trade and all of those things. And that means that you're going to get a short-term focus on aid, but none of the long-term results of global justice trying to bring development to the poor in that long-term benefit.
When it comes to dealing with global poverty, Bill Gates has, in the space of a decade, changed the game. But the challenge remains. Tonight, 1 person in 7 on the planet will go to sleep hungry. 1 in 4 live in absolute poverty. 2,500 people will die today of malaria.
Well, we're joined now by Bill Gates of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, by Andrew Whitty of the drug giant GlaxoSmithKline, and by Dr. Richard Sezibera, until recently the Rwandan Health Minister and now head of the East African Community and on the board of the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunisation. In a moment, we'll talk to some critics, but first, let's talk a little bit about what you're trying to do, Bill Gates. Aid agencies have been at this. Governments have been at it. What can you do, do you think, as a philanthropist that they can't do?
Well, in fact, aid agencies have had great results. Over 20 million children a year under the age of 5 died back in 1960. Now it's under 9 million. What we can do is we can accelerate that improvement by getting the very latest vaccines that the rich countries take for granted and getting them out to the poor kids. That will save millions of additional lives.
Why do you want to spend your money in that way?
Well, I want to spend my money to take the greatest inequity, the fact that these children die, and get rid of that. And vaccines are the miracle intervention that allows that to happen.
Now, Richard Sezibera, why is this our problem?
Well, it's the world's problem. Every death anywhere in the world is a death on humanity. And there's been a lot of success. Immunization rates are up across the African continent. Infant mortality rates are down. Fewer children are dying because of the intervention of an alliance like the Global Vaccine Alliance. And we have it's amazing what has happened now. We have access to more vaccines against pneumonia, against diarrhea, against now cancer, cervical cancer. Countries in Africa that were unable to vaccinate their children against pneumonia are now able to do so.
Now, Andrew Whitty, you were quoted the other day as saying that the drug companies had not been responsible citizens in the past, but that there's a change of heart occurring. In what way were they not responsible citizens?
I think, to be honest with you, during the 80s and 90s, as the industry was really growing and forming itself into what it became, people weren't focused on this agenda. And I just think that was wrong. I think it's been late getting focused on the agenda, but it has done. Over the last 7, 8 years, I think you've seen a tremendous shift in where the industry is. I think as you've seen things like the Gavi Alliance come into place 11 years ago, the industry's come alongside that very forcefully.
Why?
I think because they recognise that it's in all of our interests. There's no question
It's
that
just public relations, isn't it?
No, not at all. I think people expect in the West, whether you're in America or in Europe, people expect to see pharmaceutical industries contribute to societies who are less well off. I think people do expect to see that. I can tell you within my organisation, the majority of the people who work for us, the single biggest reason they would quote for why they work for us is a contribution to human health, not just rich people's human health, but to everybody. And those are the drivers that make us look for ways in which we can contribute to this agenda.
Okay. Well, not everyone in the aid community agrees with the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization's aims and methods. The respected charity Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, as they call themselves in America, believe that it can be done better. Daniel Berman speaks for them on access to medicine. Tell us, what do you worry about here?
I guess what I worry about is that although we really appreciate the involvement of GlaxoSmithKline, we have to be honest. Because of a relationship that we feel is a little bit too close between the Gates Foundation and donors and the companies, we feel like we're paying too much. Let me give you a very specific example. For example, the pneumocoque vaccine. Mr. Whitty, you haven't talked about the pneumocoque vaccine. You've mentioned a little bit how it's financed. This is a product that is widely available in wealthy countries. So there is the market in the wealthy countries. And in fact, the problem is that there's a $225 million subsidy that is going to GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer. And I'd like to ask Mr. Gates, why do you do it that way? For example, the Serum Institute told us that they were blocked by patents, and that if they had some help in overcoming patents, they would already have their pneumocoque vaccine on the market. I know that IP has been very important in your business, and I guess that puts you in a difficult
Intellectual
situation.
property, you mean?
Intellectual property.
Okay.
When I'm giving money away, I bring a strong business sense to making sure it's very well spent. And so when we created the group that helps purchase this pneumococcal vaccine, we researched what does it cost to build that factory, what do those ingredients cost, and in fact there was not the capacity to serve the poor world. By getting people together to make a commitment, it allowed companies, including GSK, to spend a lot of money. And so what we're getting in terms of saving lives, if any organization should celebrate what happened today, what's going to happen with these lives saves, you'd think it would be MSF, because this is medicine at work. This is medicine at its best. We're saving millions of lives, and there's no foolishness about the costs here.
Mr. Gates, I think we totally agree on the mission. I think we agree with GlaxoSmithKline. We vaccinate 10 million children a year. So we're with you there. We believe the more vaccines that can get out there, the better. We're talking about how the money is used. And in fact, this scheme with the subsidy was actually was created to stimulate development when there weren't vaccines. So I don't think it makes sense to use this scheme in this particular case, because the vaccine has been developed for rich countries.
Can I maybe just specifically address that, just on a couple of points you raised today?
Okay.
The first is that in terms of intellectual property or patents getting in the way, neither for rotavirus vaccine nor for pneumococcal vaccine, at least as far as GSK is concerned, are there any material patents. And nobody has ever asked us to license the immaterial ones that we have. I think that good evidence of that is you can see immediately today, you have a number of Indian and other companies who are themselves developing their own version of products. So I think it's just straight, just straight wrong to assert this as IP as an issue. Now, in terms of the incentivization, it's quite interesting to look back. The world's first pneumococcal vaccine was launched around 1999-2000.
Correct.
And there was a limit of production capacity. I think the Gavi Foundation identified this as a major opportunity in the developing world and aimed to stimulate that activity. What this incentive really is that for the first few years that the vaccine is on the market, we achieve a price of about $7 per dose. That is very substantially, 70 or 80% lower than people are paying in the West already.
What
Then
it means
it
is
drops.
people in the West are paying more in order that people in the poorer world pay less.
Well, and I make no apology for that. I
Right.
think
Now, you accept that's what's happening?
Absolutely, and we're very upfront and transparent around tiered pricing. The people in the richest countries should pay the most. People in the middle,
For the
the people
same
in the
conditions.
poorest. Absolutely, because it's unreasonable.
Some lives are more valuable than others.
No, but it's unreasonable to expect somebody in the poorest country to contribute towards shareholder profits and R&D of the future.
But
when
it's
in fact,
okay for the National
consequence-
Health Service to do so.
No, because the challenge here is to try and make sure that access is achieved.
That story that you just said needs to be researched. And I was directly involved in the process with the Gavi board. I was part of a committee, and I resigned from that committee, Mr. Gates, because you loaned 5 McKinsey consultants to that committee. The committee was to lower prices in vaccines for Gavi. Now, how can the McKinsey consultants help us lower prices when they consult with companies like Mr. Whitty's? So I'm worried about the relationship between
just
Gavi...
engage with that question, Bill Gates, please.
The reason I give to Gavi, and I feel so great about the pricing they achieved, is because the expertise to understand what these things cost, we've spent the money to understand that. And yes, it's very smart people from Oliver Wyman, McKinsey. I've gone in and spent time on these things. These prices are coming down because we want to save more lives. And time is on our side.
I want to ask one other question to you, Richard Sisebera. Why don't your governments buy these drugs direct?
Because we can't afford them. That is the simple answer. But I would like to welcome industry. What industry is actually doing with tier pricing is exactly what governments across the world and in the developing world do. Through social health insurance schemes, you make sure that the more well-off pay relatively more for their health than the poorest. And so what they're doing is absolutely right. It's the right way to go. It makes vaccines available to the poorest of the poor in the world. It makes governments able to deliver these life-saving vaccines to the world. It is the right thing to do.
Okay, thank you, Daniel Berman. Well, now, our second critic is Deborah Doan from the World Development Movement. They believe that much of Gavi's work doesn't get at the real underlying problems in the world today. So what's your anxiety here?
Few would disagree with vaccinating millions of children. You can't disagree with that. I think the issue we have is that it's a bit of a distraction. So these sorts of top-down, business-led philanthropic solutions distract from the bigger picture. And that bigger picture is this. It's all well and good to be vaccinated against preventable diseases, but if you send those families back out and they don't have land on which to farm because it's been grabbed by big corporates because of land grabbing, or if they can't feed their families because of speculation on food prices, on food commodity prices, because they're spending 90% of their income on everyday foodstuffs and they can't educate their children, all of these things will be masked and lost, and we'll be having the same discussion in 20 years' time. The reason those bigger issues aren't dealt with, if I can just one more point, is that you could look at progressive taxation could be far more important. Dealing with global monopolies could be far more important. Enabling people to have the policies to feed themselves would be a much more effective solution for dealing with poverty than vaccination programs.
This is about the children and the mothers of those children, and whether we take the technology that every rich child takes for granted and make it available. If she has a scheme to change the economic world order, that's all well and good. In the meantime, let's not let the millions of children die.
That's why you chose health as opposed to any other aspect of development.
Well, actually, I'm involved in many aspects of development.
This is the priority of the moment.
No, we do things actually at the same time. We do agriculture, we do sanitation.
You don't think you get in the way of governments?
I think children dying is not a good thing. I don't think any mother wants to see her children die. These vaccines are about saving those lives.
The accusation is not that you think it's a good thing. No one thinks it's a good thing that children die.
But they have been dying, and only with the generosity we saw today, only by getting these prices down, will their lives be saved.
If we spent more of our time, I mean, in developing public health programs, one of the concerns we have, much like MSF, is we're seeing public health and public interest sideline over these technocratic solutions.
Wait a minute.
So in the instance of vaccinations, they favor big pharma. In the interest of when we're looking at another area of development, which I know you work in, we're looking at solutions that favors big agribusiness rather than small-scale farm production, for example.
There's no favoritism. There's a bid price. The lowest price bid for the vaccines come in. Vaccines are public health. You can't contrast public health vaccines. Vaccines are the center of public health. They're the greatest victory of public health in all of history. That's why we're down from 20 million dying a year.
There's a question here of accountability too, isn't it? I mean, governments are accountable to their citizens. They win power, they lose power by the judgments they make. Who are you accountable to when you decide to make these, what everyone agrees are well-meant interventions?
Well, anyone who buys a product, if you buy a car, if you buy a house, you're you're taking your success and choosing what you're expressing your values. My values are that all the wealth I have should go back to society, and it should help the very poorest. And as I looked at all the ways to help out the poorest, vaccinations rose to the top of the list as the way to change their lives. The kids who live, if they don't get sick, their brains fully develop and they can achieve their potential. This is a pretty clear win, and the fact that, yes, malaria research is being done now and vaccines are being delivered, that's a great thing.
Dr. Sisebera, do you worry that why the Western governments or Western philanthropists like Bill Gates are making judgments on your behalf?
No, they are not making judgments on the behalf of the developing world. Developing world countries are co-financing these vaccines, the price of these vaccines. The health budgets are up. They are targets of 15%. Rwanda is already past 15%. Other governments are coming up. And yes, it is true that we must invest in roads and in agriculture and in food security, and governments are doing that. But our people must be alive. The children must be alive to enjoy these fruits, and that is the importance of vaccination.
I want to ask you one further question, Andrew Whitty, and it's about a potential conflict of interest here. Drug companies such as yourselves, which are both supplying medicines or vaccines and sitting on the board which makes judgments about whether they should be supplied. That's a conflict of interest, isn't it?
No. So GSK used to have a seat on the Gavi board. In fact, we've just rotated off it. There are 2 industry seats on the Gavi board. We've just come off, somebody else has just come on. The Gavi board, when you look around the table, almost everybody has some kind of vested interest. You're either a potential supplier or a potential recipient or a potential delivery agency. So everybody around that table more or less has a vested interest. What's been clear with the way the Gavi board operates is if anything specific comes up, of course, the member from the industry recuses himself from the meeting, leaves the meet, of course. The balance here is that we don't end up in a situation where you don't have any expertise around the table. So we have people talking about the art of the possible without any knowledge of what actually goes on. And so having somebody there is important. I think, and this would pass any scrutiny over whether or not these people can assert any undue influence. I'm sure they do not.
All right, thank you, Deborah Doan. Finally, Ian Birrell, who's a journalist and a former speechwriter for David Cameron. The question, does aid actually work? Is it worth all this time and money? And in the long run, does it help those who are in need? What's your pitch?
Well, I do agree with Mr. Gates that actually vaccination is probably about the best use of aid and malaria research, and I think that's right. But I have a more fundamental issue with more fundamental problem with the whole issue of aid. By countries getting maybe half their income from aid are not going to have a need, and we can see this again and again, to respond to the needs of the people there. We're breaching accountability, and indeed Harvard Medical School has shown that when you put money in to health services, health spending declines. In places like Ethiopia and Rwanda, British aid is funding a government which is sending hitmen here, and on top of that, British aid directly funded a media council which banned newspapers, independent newspapers, and banned an electoral commission which stopped independent challenges. And I think all these self-appointed saviours, there is a problem and a reason why we keep hearing Western voices are always the voices for aid, not African voices, unless they're involved in the industry, because the image of Africa is being destroyed by aid. And that's why people see Africa as a supplicant rather than this fast-changing, growing place where 6 of the fastest-growing economies are there.
Okay, let's deal with that last point as it's freshest in our minds first. Bill Gates, do you worry about who's driving this whole aid enterprise?
Well, the politically elected governments are by far the biggest donors here. And so politicians like David Cameron, they make a choice based on what they think the policies should be, and the voters will eventually get to weigh in, just like in many other countries.
What about this question of helping to support repressive regimes?
Well, certainly vaccination, I don't think it's quite a stretch to say that it supports repressive regimes, or maybe they should refuse the aid because that'll improve their image and just let the children die.
That wasn't what I was saying. I was saying British aid, not your aid. British aid has directly gone to repressive regimes. That's very different from the sort of things that you're doing.
Well, we do vaccination. When we decide to save children in a country, we don't go and look at everything the government's done and say, oh, they're not a very nice government. We're willing to fund vaccination for all the children of the world, independent of what's going on with that government.
Richard Sezibera, you, of course, are Rwandan, aren't you?
Yes.
So you stand accused in all of this to some degree.
Well, two things. First of all, it's not true that the Rwandan government sent hit squads all over the world. But I find
Scotland Yard, of course,
I find the discourse a bit dispiriting because, on the one hand, British government, on the other, regimes. Now, the discourse of some people who look at Africa and the developing world as if we do not have universal values. And of course, if there is a repressive regime, the people in that country will raise up against that country, against their leaders through a democratic process.
Sure, but if your government is, the entire edifice of your country is being supported by Western aid, there is less incumbency upon you as a government to render yourself accountable to your citizens.
Absolutely. It is not correct that a government should be supported entirely by the Western world. And in fact, my own belief and the belief of many Africans is that we should use aid to get to win ourselves off aid. Now, it is the quality of the aid. First of all, the aid must come in to fund a country-owned, country-designed, country-run program. And the more you do that, the better. And secondly, the accountability for delivery must be put where it belongs, on the shoulders of the leaders of these countries. If they can't, then they have to answer for it.
You're entirely comfortable with the way this whole thing operates, are you, Andrew Whitting?
I share Bill's view to a large degree.
You've never had anxieties about a dependency culture, about the image of Africa?
I think on aid as a general concept, I would probably share some of the questions. I think it's really important when you talk about aid in the very biggest sense. But when you focus on vaccines, next to washing your hands, it's the single biggest healthcare intervention in history. And when you go to villages who have only just received their first solar-powered fridge, and as a result, for the very first time, people have been vaccinated against basic illnesses and diseases which are killing those children all of the time. When you see that actually happen on the ground, it's really difficult to walk away from that and say we shouldn't be trying to do this more often than we have been in the past.
Can I just finish with you, Bill Gates, on a personal note? Everyone in the world knows who you are, and everyone in the world almost uses your products in some way or another. Do you hope that this sort of initiative will be what you're remembered for?
I don't care to be remembered at all. I do hope that we can get that number of 9 million children a year who die down to 7 million, then 5 million, then 3 million. And there's some wonderful things in the work. Today was a big day, the pledging to buy these 2 new vaccines. We're partnered with GSK on a malaria vaccine that, with luck, in 3 years will be in a position to actually start delivering that. So the advances in technology should not just be for the richest. In fact, we should tilt our work to help the poorest. And that's why I'm excited about this second career that I've got.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks.
I want to start with Bill Gates today. As you know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has donated billions of dollars, and Warren Buffett, I believe, has pledged something like $40 billion over so many years to vaccinate the planet because they love them in order to save them, right? I mean, isn't that what we were all told? Now, of course, we have done extensive work here on vaccinations, which ones are good, if any, and why we should be just a little more inquisitive before we roll up our sleeves, stick out our arm, and take the shots. So we're looking at Bill Gates, and we're wondering, well, I mean, you know, what is your real agenda here, Bill? Well, he gave a conference here over the last couple of days. We call it Eugenics 101, where he comes out and puts this formula together about how we're going to get CO2 down to zero. Now, some of you have watched Soylent Green. Here on this program, we have revised the kicker statement, the gotcha statement in Soylent Green, and that is, CO2 is people. That is correct. Bill Gates wants to bring the CO2 levels down to not manageable levels, not where they were 30 years ago or 100 years ago or whatever, down to zero. Now, before you do the math, I'm going to give you Boy Genius, the man who admittedly, and it is rather historical, stole most of his inventions, college dropout, Bill Gates, not the richest man in the world, folks, that's a myth. Here he is, this is a very short clip, giving a conference, doing mathematical formulas to his legions of followers, admitting what the vaccines are really for.
This equation has four factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero, and that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra, but let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
Wait a second there, Bill. I thought vaccines were supposed to help people so that they could live. Why did you throw vaccines in with reproductive agendas? Let's try that again.
Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. But there we see an increase of about 1.3.
Any questions? You can find that clip at deadlinelive.info. I'm sure there's more in there. I would assume that in sometime in this, hour, 2-hour lecture, he said, oh, by the way, I didn't mean to say that vaccines were going to lower the population. Note to Africa, run. Isn't it interesting, and we have covered this for years, if you look at the science lab, the New World Order experimentation lab, the globalist science experiment, which is Africa, where is it on Earth where anything is worse? And this is the place that these guys have been going in and helping the people all these years. Well, of course, if you've read Henry Kissinger's expose on depopulating the planet, you'll understand what this is all about. And the excuse for all of this, of course, is global warming. It's been hasn't been very warm here in Central Texas. At least get the vernacular right. At least get the verbiage right. It is now called climate change because global warming, as has been admitted by the top alleged scientist figuring this out for the United Nations, that there hasn't been any warming on a whole scale in the world since 1995. So why the rush to start vaccinating everybody? Bill Gates just admitted it. And the Kool-Aid drinking establishment status quo types that just love anything that Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or Al Gore, for that matter, say, are laughing and applauding. Do you think, how many people think that he was questioned about this? I guess I can tell you we have a call into Bill Gates. I doubt that that call will be received. And then here's Al Gore wishing global warming weren't real. Well, he doesn't have to wish too hard, does he? Again, it was just admitted by Phil Jones, who's been sent packing. He admitted a few weeks ago he's been contemplating suicide, that this is such the whole ClimateGate thing was just such a scandal. The failure that was the summit, the Copenhagen summit, where we were supposed to do a little more than just pay the rest of the world to shut up $100 billion. Al Gore wishes global warming weren't real. Well, it isn't. At least not now it isn't. He goes on to say climate skeptics cite recent snowfall parts in the East Coast have mocked Al Gore. Tycoon Donald Trump says that Gore should be stripped of his Nobel Peace Prize for warning about climate change. It's going to keep snowing in D.C. until Al Gore cries uncle, says Senator Jim DeMint, writing on Twitter. Al Gore cites global data that show last month was the second hottest January since surface temperatures were first measured 130 years ago. And the last 10 years were the hottest decades since modern records have been kept. Now, also in this article, New York Times, he pens himself. Also in the article, he admits that there were many mess-ups. A lot of the data was incorrect. Oh, no, that wasn't on purpose. It was just all a bunch of incompetence. That's all it ever is. Whenever we see anything that involves the government or multinational governments and it goes wrong, well, it's just incompetence. Of course, there's never any accountability for this. These guys are working really hard. They're working 24 hours a day to save the entire planet, and so are we, so am I. I'm also lining my pockets, setting up billions of dollars worth of carbon swapping companies and companies that will benefit from the eradication of CO2. That's you. But he wishes global warming weren't real and is now trying to pass off the information that this has been the warmest winter on record and that this was the second hottest January since surface temperatures were first measured 130 years ago. Anybody buying any of this? I mean, these people, this is what happens when you paint yourself into a corner like Al Gore. Go watch the Great Global Warming Swindle, which does a pretty good job debunking most of this. Of course, one of my claims to fame is that I once heckled Al Gore in front of an audience of about 5,000 or 6,000 people. Yes, I thought they might tear me limb from limb, but it had to be done. These fascists who are trying to use the religion of global warming to control every single little thing you do. And if that doesn't work, they're going to use Obamacare. Obamacare perestroika, as I call it. Perestroika, of course, the Russian word, which is appropriate for reform. We have talked about this for months and months. In fact, maybe about the last year or two. Back from the undead is Obamacare perestroika. Anyone buying that? Apparently not, and I don't think that the governments care too much about it. There's an interesting interview that Ron Paul did. Now I don't remember exactly where it is, but you can find it at dailypaul.com, where he's talking about answering the question, why do so many people hate the federal government? Why is the approval ratings for the federal government at the lowest it probably ever has been? Are they listening? Are they ever going to get the message?
Well, quite apart from the Gates money, the British government today committed another £800 million of taxpayers' money to be spent on aid, or vaccines specifically. The Prime Minister said that although just about every other area of spending is being cut, it was morally right to spend more on international development. The International Development Secretary, Andrew Mitchell, is here. But first, a few facts and figures about the UK aid budget. The British overseas aid budget is currently £8.1 billion, rising to £11.4 billion in 2014. It's a 34% real terms increase when almost every other government department is seeing cuts. The biggest recipients of British aid include India, Ethiopia and Bangladesh. The UK is now one of the biggest aid donors in the world. Last year, the British gave away just over half of 1% of the national income. That is a higher proportion than Germany, twice as high as in Japan, and 5 times as much as Italy. Well, the International Development Secretary is, as I mentioned, here now. David Cameron said today that it was right to increase your budget, the International Development Budget, at the time that other budgets were being cut. It was morally the right thing to do. Why?
I think there are 2 key arguments. I think it's morally the right thing to do. We live in a world where there are these extraordinary discrepancies of opportunity, and our generations have a chance really to do something about it. And the pledging conference today, I think, is a very good example of that. But it's not just that it's morally right, it's also very much in our national interest.
But this is £300 or more from every household in the country at a time when the services they need are being cut and when they themselves are finding life very often very tough.
Well, I don't pretend that this is an easy issue, but as a proportion of our expenditure, it's relatively small. It's under 1% of national income.
But growing.
I think a country like ours can afford that. And if you look at the generosity of people in Britain, for example, in Comic Relief, which over the last 2 times is against a background of much more serious economic situation.
Yeah, but that is a decision.
People have been more generous each time.
Absolutely. They've got a choice in the matter. They have no choice about whether they pay their taxes. They pay their taxes, convention has it, in order they can be defended by the armed forces, educated in the schools and universities, and all the rest of it. Instead of which they see all those things being cut, and you, by force of law, taking more money to spend in places like Africa.
Well, I think that the national development budget does have a huge impact, and of course it also impacts on people's security, the point you've just made about defending the state. Our security is not only defended by guns and tanks, it's also defended by training the police in Afghanistan, by building up governance structures in the Middle East, and of course by getting girls into school. So all of that contributes to our national security, and that is why I say it's not just a moral issue, important though that is, it's also very much in our national interest.
How much money are we giving to Uganda?
We're giving something like £70 million this year to
Is it
Uganda.
true the President of Uganda spent £30 million on an executive jet?
That happened under the last government. I do not approve of that. I think it is the wrong use of their money. And if governments, which
So
the British
why do we keep
taxpayer
on giving it to them?
well, if governments under us spend money in that way, then we will take action to seek to stop it. But in doing that, of course, we want to try and make sure we don't end up afflicting the poorest people in those countries. We want to try and make the government more accountable, more transparent, and more open to its own
What
citizens.
are we doing giving money to India when it apparently can afford a space program?
Well,
we can't.
India is a development paradox. There are more poor people in India than in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. But that is why we have frozen the program this year. For the first time since the war, India is not our largest program. And the money is now being spent in the poorest areas, and up to half of it over the next 4 years will be on pro-poor private sector development.
And yet the government of India chooses to spend money on a space program.
Well, the British development efforts in India, which is a tiny proportion of what the Indians themselves, I mean under 1%, what they themselves spend on education and healthcare, has a colossal effect on and benefit for India. And as part of Britain's programme and its partnership with India, which was greatly rejuvenated by the Prime Minister last year, the development programme plays a small but important part.
We actually give them less than they give to other countries in assistance of one kind or another. Isn't that correct?
That's not really true, because the Indian, what you would refer to as the Indian aid program, is not the same as what we would call an aid program. It's more a credit system for business.
You're
So you
splitting hairs.
can't. No, I think you can't compare the two. They're not the same.
Isn't the real problem here that people like you belong to a generation that looks back on Live Aid as being a marvellous thing, that looks back on the Gleneagles conference as being a marvellous thing, and you're simply out of step with public opinion? That might have been the case 5, 10, 20 years ago. It's not any longer.
I don't believe that's right. I think it's this point I made about our generations having the ability to make a real change in the world today. There's a new state starting in Africa, in Sudan, South Sudan, on July the 9th. A girl born today in South Sudan has more chance of dying when she has a baby than completing primary school. Our generations can do something about this, and that's why I'm so delighted that the conference today for the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunisation can have a real impact now on kids who die overseas from diseases which our children don't die from.
You have talked about this country becoming an aid superpower. Some people would characterise it, as you used to characterise the Labour Party, as being very generous with other people's money. But why is it that we've decided to do that, and yet the Italians, the Germans, the Japanese have not decided to go that route?
Well, when I said we were an aid, I said we were a development superpower. What I meant was in just the same way that America is a military superpower, so because of the brilliant leadership of Britain around the world on development, we have a huge impact on tackling these dreadful diseases and dreadful difficulties, saving lives, which we've been talking about. And I think it's part of the British DNA to be generous to those who are much less fortunate than we are. The extraordinary discrepancies of wealth which we discussed earlier, and opportunity, we can do something about that, and we will.
Andrew Mitchell, thank you very much.
Thank you.